With the intake side mostly together, the exhaust side needed to be looked after. A little rust had started to appear here, so it's a little VD40 and some rag to rub it down. There are a few gouges in the engine block here and there, so I guess I had seen that before and guessed I would use a little filler, because there is no real gasket. A couple of nuts locked together on each of the pin bolt holding the exhaust, and all of them were bolted into the block. With them all in place, we started to look at the exhaust manifold. I planned the nuts I had ordered. I thought it would be this lock nut kind that are kind of squeezed together a little to help them not come undone, but that wasn't the case. When you buy new nuts for this from Komatsu these days, they are just your average nut, so plan to reuse as many of them that had survived. Had bought some kind of ceramic glue of some kind. It's actually made to seal up wood burning stoves, but I figured a little bit of that couldn't hurt to add on there. Sounds like they suggest you add some graphite grease or something, but I added that. We'll see how it holds up. Tightened things up. You have all these spacers. In two places there are kind of narrower or shorter spacers than all the other places. All the long bolts I added like a normal nut, because there are more things going on there. My dad had added these pin bolts earlier, and here I ran into some issues. It's not like the port on the exhaust manifold really lines up super well. And here I have the spacer on there also, because it's a spacer before the turbo, and well, to make it line up as good as possible without starting to grind too much, the gasket itself, we made the holes a little oval so it could ride like it could be moved down a little. Flipping the spacer around a little to find where it was kind of the least restriction, and then we put the turbo on there. I had also started with some brackets for holding the muffler. Here I also used those like pinched nuts, even if I think it was just normal nuts here when I started, so I will be a little short on those kind of nuts. My dad helped hold the muffler and started tightening that up. I actually had to bring back out the bracket that sits on the exhaust manifold, because I had placed some washers under it that made it be a little too far out. It was a little bit of test and moving things around to get it to line up as good as possible with the turbo. Removed some old gasket from the drain pipe on the turbo. I purchased fresh gaskets for everything up here, apart from where it connects to the muffler. That one I didn't remove. Tightened up the hose clamp holding the return pipe. I also installed that feed pipe, the pressure side for the oil on the turbo, and then there is a clamp holding the two pipes together. The intake side that pressurized the intake on the turbo had a new O-ring for that, and it's kind of a hose clamp that holds it onto the turbo, and then there is another hose clamp where it goes into the intercooler. My dad helped out, because this is one heavy beefy little piece that holds the air filter and the expansion tank for the coolant. couple of bolts that bolts it into the engine block, and then the hose that connects the expansion tank to the coolant system. That had kind of shifted a little on its mounting, so loosened the clamps and moved it around a little, and then tightened things up. Next was the air filter, kind of a poor angle, but yeah, had to loosen up the hose clamps a little more to have them slip over the support for it. Also, I found that I had forgot an electric connection sensor on the intake, and then the hoses to the top of the expansion tank for the coolant. A bracket holding some sensor for the fire suppression system, and then the diesel heater could be folded back in. Notice that I'm not sure if it's a like one-way valve or something, a plastic thing on the far side was touching that heat shield from the exhaust, and that didn't feel good, so loosened the clamp and moved that around a little, and moved this hose around a little and tightened it so things weren't touching that heat shield. Bolted it into place. So also reinstalled the bracket that helps you lift the hydraulic oil tank that was removed at some point when trying to locate that sound. That I hope it's the hydraulic pump that got a new bearing. Since I know these machines will sit for longer periods of time here and there in the next few years, I installed an extra plate on top of the oil feed line for the turbo, because if it's been sitting you should give it a little oil before starting. And we drilled a hole in it and added a bolt with a copper washer and a couple of longer bolts to clamp it in place, so you can undo that middle bolt and feed it a little oil before startup if it's been sitting for a long time. In the compression test video you can see where we have drilled that extra hole in the middle and smoothed out the surface on the top, so because we added an extra seal on top of it, and then clamp that plate extra on there. Tightening up that extra bolt there in the middle, everything else was tightened up, so hopefully that will help out and give the turbo a longer life, even if it has sporadic use in the next few years. To ensure that even if something comes undone here and it can't really put the same amount of stress, and as I think has happened when they cracked the exhaust, we've cut some pieces to fill up some gaps in these oval holes, so even if it kind of comes undone a little, it will stop on these and not put too much strain on them, and hopefully it can be caught before it breaks anything, but hopefully they will stay in place for the foreseeable future.